So, welcome to the politics portion of our show. We have a lot to talk about. I missed a week. So, we're going to start off with some of the stuff that I think is the most pressing. So, as you probably know, COP26 ended 2 weeks ago now, and there were a lot of expectations conference, and many activists were calling it the last hope, the last opportunity that humanity has to really get itself back on track for climate change. And I made a prediction 2 weeks ago now that COP26 was a failure. And unfortunately, despite the high hopes, I think I was mostly proven right. So we're going to go through a little bit of what we got from COP26, and then I'm going to kind of break down why I think it's not promising, to put it as mildly as I possibly can. Okay, so the conference goals together, but they were so. Let's just talk through a couple of them, right? So the big one was the phasing down of coal by 2030. Now, the original text of the so-called Glasgow, the original in the Glasgow Agreement was supposed to be phasing out coal, but at the last minute, India, China switched the rules, switched things around. They kind of, pulled their way in out to phase down by 2030, which obviously is a huge loss for mankind. So much so that the president of COP26 isn't really worth much. I mean, you've fucked the planet, right? I mean, sorry doesn't really cut it. But let's just put that aside. We'll come back to that more later. The other increase was, hey, there was going to be a commitment to allow a financial commitment for Africa and for the subcontinent to give them development funds, so there would not be this time period where the economies, as they were developing in developing countries, economic scale with coal, and then could come down off it, right? So in theory, we're trying to dodge this hump that many developing countries have articulated they need, because that spike, obviously, we want them to get, if there has to be a hump in the first place, right? I'm getting ahead of myself. If there has to be a hump in the first place, we want them to reach it sooner and then come down very quickly, right? That will allow us to reduce the most amount of carbon emissions, right? Carbon in the atmosphere and stuff like that. But what the ideal world would be, that actually there is no hump at all, right? We just kind of cruise through, and these economies develop kind of on a stagnant line of carbon emissions, or even ideally, right, steadily declining. But as I talked about on a previous episode, many underdeveloped economies are kind of coming into industrialization on that we have that is most easily accessible to them because of the way that the money works. So, up with increasing amount of carbon emissions, and then they can start to come down. So there needed to be a commitment by wealthier countries to give money in sufficient amounts that we wouldn't need to get over that hump. So originally, there had been $100 billion pledged to help with Africa's development, but India is also a developing country. Despite its technological ability, it's still technically a developing country. So there needed to be additional funds for India and countries who are in similar situations as India, are developing but are not, as developing as some other countries, like the ones that were being talked about specifically in Africa. And so there was commitments made by a variety of countries to get there, to give more money. Now, the context round of money, the $100 billion per year that's needed to help these African countries avoid kind of the hump of economic development in terms of carbon emissions, that hasn't been being met. So I think there's a couple $1 billion being given every year. I don't remember the exact number, but it's very small. And so there was a lot of criticism of COP and its participants because the thought was, hey, if you couldn't pony up $100 billion from last year, you've made all these commitments for larger sums of money. There's no way you're going to be able to do it. So I think that's a very valid criticism, and I think it's another area where COP26 failed. Another thing that we supposedly got out of COP26 was a commitment to electric vehicles and to electric power grids. Unfortunately, though, this agreement was not signed by the United States, China, India, or Russia. And right there, honestly, that makes the agreement worthless, right? Because the biggest emitters based on electric vehicles are those countries who didn't sign, right? So very clearly, we're in a situation where the people who are doing the most harm are not willing to play ball with the people who are being the most affected, who, by the way, are at least demonstrating a willingness to change their economies for the greater good. There was another proposal at COP that failed as well, which was for the amount of carbon emissions caps, the amount of carbon emissions caps per country to be developed globally, and to essentially be imposed globally based on global agreements. Unfortunately, nowadays, what are considered our carbon cap, our carbon ceiling per country, is actually developed by each country individually without discussing with other countries, without negotiating with other countries. So unfortunately, this got voted down as well. The usual suspects against this, and this is very disappointing because you get to a place where larger developed countries are saying, well, we think we can afford this many tons per year in carbon emissions, and they're not, that what they're assuming for themselves, they could be assuming a bigger portion of the pie than they should be allowed to have, right? And there's no one really to stop them because these numbers aren't being negotiated, right? People aren't going to other countries and saying, well, actually, you say I'm just making up numbers here, but you say you can put up 300 tons of CO2 per year, but actually, given your population and development and stuff, maybe it should be closer to like 250, right? And again, I'm just making up numbers, but you can get a sense where, if a country is allowed to kind of decide how much footprint they're allowed to have, you're going to give yourself wiggle room, right? Because you're regulating yourselves. It's the same reason that typically we don't like businesses to regulate themselves. So, I think this should be taken with a large grain of salt. Truthfully speaking, I think all of this was a failure. I think it's just, it looks colossally hopeless. The major polluters are not willing to sign on. But if you look at, supposedly what was committed to, I mean, it looks great on paper, right? And if you Google, COP26 achievement list, you'll go to some place and they'll say, oh, we got this, we got this, and we got this, and we got this. And then they'll talk about some of the things that I talked about. And they'll talk about them as missed opportunities. But really, the oceans are already rising. Weather is already getting more difficult, right? Oh, one more thing that was talked about as being a major achievement for this COP was, oh, well, now we're talking about adaptation as opposed to just prevention of climate change. And sure, that posture of adaptation versus just, mitigation or avoidance of climate change, I mean, it makes sense, but it's not an achievement. We're already having to adapt. So all we've done is to take the language of adaptation and add it into our additional failures, right? If adaptation look anything like mitigation or avoidance looked like in past COPs, then it's, we're doomed, right? We're screwed because we obviously didn't avoid it, right? All these agreements, all these meetings that we've been having haven't really avoided any of the consequences of climate change. But now we're also going to use the same body to adapt, right? I mean, what's going to happen is, unfortunately, is by the accident of your birth will determine whether you survive climate change or not. If you're in a rich country and you have the power and the finances and the technology available the fewest numbers of your population will die. And if that has to be achieved by hook or by crook, then that'll happen. I mean, the thing that really worries me as a socialist personally is that when we get to eco catastrophe, even more so than we're seeing now, by the way, don't get me wrong, we are in eco catastrophe now. But when we get to a place where it gets worse, you're going to see things like climate refugees. We're going to see wars over water. And in that situation, people are going to move away from slow moving, moderate government types like democracy, right? You're going to move in one of two directions. Actually, a good friend of mine has said this multiple times. The only alternative to eco socialism is eco fascism, and it's true. At some point, people are going to get tired of the moderation that comes with democratic governance, right? And checks and balances, and not allowing so many people to move things. These systems are inherently conservative by nature. And I don't mean conservative politically necessarily, although they are. They're conservative in the way that they make decisions, right? They're cold, they're calculating, they're slow, they're all these synonyms you could think of for slow and bureaucratic. But people will move away from that as the situation gets more dire, and they'll either go in one of two directions, right? And by the way, the right wing is already queuing up for what might become eco-fascism, because there's already talk on the right wing about immigrants, and immigrants are dirty, or whatever, right? There's all this terrible rhetoric around what immigrants are. And this is just before we have major amounts of climate refugees coming. In fact, there is some belief that the Syrian civil war was actually the first climate war. And there's a long discussion. I can't think of who did it. It may have been Al Jazeera, actually, who did like a little mini doc on why Syria was the first climate war. It had to do with desertification of farmland and people moving to cities. It's an interesting piece. I think it's about 10 minutes long. I think it's Al Jazeera, but just you can look it up on YouTube. If I remember to, I'll put a link to it somewhere, or I'll publish the link on our Facebook page if I remember to do it. If not, someone just message us and I'll find it. But anyway, the more we have these wars that are related to climate change, the more there are going to be climate refugees. And we saw how Syrian refugees were treated by the right wing, and honestly by liberals too. There wasn't a ton of really good immigration policy, even from individuals who consider themselves to be liberals. I mean, truthfully, it's scary to see the types of rhetoric and the type of violence that is being used against refugees. And we're actually going to talk about this a little later in the show. But, it's just one more thing that's, if, and this all relates to COP, right? Because the do now, the harsher it's going to be, the harder it's going to be, the more wars there will be, the more conflicts there will be, and the more pressure will build on currently democratic systems to take extreme measures, either to become eco-socialist, right, and to fundamentally change what we do, and to make collective efforts to mitigate and reverse climate change, or it's going to turn eco-fascism, where it becomes very individualized in the way that we mitigate and protect against climate change, right? It'll be things like not allowing any immigrants to come in, or doing worse things to them. So we really have to be careful, as we move forward, because we're having all these conferences, and another COP was scheduled. COP27 next year will be in Egypt. Nothing's getting done. We're not doing anything. We're saying lots of words. I mean, Greta Thunberg really got it right when she said blah, 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 right? Because that's always really what we've gotten. The people who can help the most are refusing to do so. The people who are hurting the most are trying to propose the newest ideas. And, it's just painful to watch. I mean, I'm so lucky that I was born in a rich country, and I'm doing well financially, and I might be okay through all of this, but it's not the world that we should be living in. And, it's really disappointing, all of it, really, and frightening too. I mean, I would be lying if I told you guys that I was comfortable with a lot of what was happening. And I personally am comfortable in my kind of financial situation overall, but I look out in the world, and it's dangerous and it's scary, and I feel really bad. And and yeah, I think I want to draw the line with this segment. Honestly, it's just, we had this conference, we supposedly got these things out of it, but the biggest players aren't signing on to the agreements. So what good are they? I mean, what's the point?
Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye for now.